Remind me, what would Labour do specifically to deter people getting on those boats?
Yeah, we would do many things differently to the government. Unfortunately, they haven't had a plan, and actually this most recent bill is just a warmed-up version of what they introduced before. It hasn't deterred. It's actually led to, for example, the people smugglers actually receiving more funds than they did before. The first thing that we would do is we would stop the situation where there's incredibly slow processing of people who come over, whether it's by boats or other means. Only 1% of people who came over by boats last year have actually been processed. So Yvette Cooper's been crystal clear. We focus on making sure that we speedily were processing people. There will be people who have a right to be here, obviously. We've always had that tradition as a country, but where people do not have the right to be here, we shouldn't see those cases going on for months, even years in many cases. Secondly, we would make sure the National Crime Agency actually had the resources and the powers that it needs to crack down on the people smugglers. Labour's made many suggestions to Robert Jenrick and the Conservatives about what needs to be done there. For example, we want to see the National Crime Agency working with other governments and their services. We want to see proper action being taken with the French government, for example, to be really driving down what's taking place with those criminal people smugglers. And then the final thing, of course, that we would do is have proper return agreements with other countries. Again, something that the Conservative government promised to deliver, that they haven't delivered. Labour would be focused on making sure that we had those agreements.
But none of that is concrete legislation, is it?
Well, it's concrete measures that would deliver very rapid change. We've seen the Conservatives passing legislation which hasn't not only made the situation any better, it's actually, in some cases, some would argue, made the situation even worse. We had legislation passed last year, which the Conservatives said would deal with these issues. It hasn't. We've actually seen the number of people, for example, accommodated in hotels increasing. Now, that's terrible for everyone. It's awful for the people left in limbo there, but it's terrible also for the taxpayer. This is really expensive. And every expert analysis of what the Conservatives are setting out now suggests that we'll see even more people being housed in those kinds of hotels because of their approach. Labour's got a very different approach. It's a practical one to deal with these issues.
We saw the BB Stockholm, that accommodation boat arrive on the south coast this week. What would Labour do about that? Would you have more of those or would you get rid of them?
Well, we would seek not to have more of those kinds of facilities because we would want to make sure that people will actually processed speedily. If you look at what's happened over the last 13 years, you've not seen a focus from government on this issue. You've seen those waiting times, the ultimate amount of time it takes from the moment someone makes an application to when it's processed, just lengthening and lengthening under the Conservatives. That, as I said, is not good for anyone. Labour would make sure that we got a grip on that we were actually properly fast-tracking, dealing with cases properly. We've done that before, actually, when Labour was in government, when there was an issue, we dealt with it. We've not seen that from the Conservatives. We've had a lot of hot air, but we've not had delivery.
OK, the election results, pretty solid set of election results for the Labour Party. You all seem pretty happy. 536 council seats up. Do you expect, not hope, expect that you will form a majority government at the next election? Yes,
I genuinely do. On the basis of these results, I think not only did we see that lead for Labour obviously lengthening, but we also saw that Labour was winning and with really big swings in many of the areas that are critically important for us forming that majority government. Of course, these elections didn't include Scotland, and actually in Scotland we're moving ahead as well. So yes, I do believe that we are on track to form a majority government.
OK, you believe that. The respected Sky News election analyst Michael Thrasher says no. He said you would fall short, 28 seats short of a majority. This is his prediction if we extrapolate out those figures. You can see it there, 28 seats short. This government has been mired in all sorts of problems. We've had 3 prime ministers, economically, the massive squeeze in incomes since the Second World War. Why do you think you didn't do better than that?
Well, actually, I think that Michael Thrasher's been very clear that certain assumptions fed into his model, particularly assumptions around what's likely to take place in Scotland. And Labour is moving forward very strongly in Scotland. We also didn't see, of course, elections in London, nor in many of our really big cities during this set of elections. So actually to be extrapolating from the overall picture in terms of a general election isn't that helpful. The most helpful thing here is to look at the places where Labour was picking up support, because they're indicative of whether we're going to be winning in those real swing marginal seats. And in so many of those places, Stoke, Dover, many places right up and down the country, we saw Labour making gains that were really pretty large gains. They show we're on track for that majority government.
But a lot of people said they should have been bigger and wonder what it is, that people are not voting Labour for. Is it policy? Is it personality of perhaps your leader, or is it the history of past Labour governments? What do you think is the thing that is putting people off that perhaps should, in your mind, be voting Labour?
Well, I have to say I didn't find people being put off. I campaigned up and down the country from Swindon all the way up to Sunderland during these elections. I spoke with hundreds, maybe even pushing thousands of people, I don't know, really very many people during the campaign and before it. And what I found overwhelmingly was that people are feeling that pressure from the cost of living crisis every single day. They don't have a government that's taking action to support them. Labour's plans, particularly that plan to plug the windfall tax gap so that we could freeze council tax, was very popular on the doorstep. So was our plan, of course, to get rid of the non-dom tax status and use that money to massively boost our NHS workforce. So people could see that Labour was setting out those solutions. We do have many months, of course. It appears until the next general election. I wish it was going to come sooner, because I think our country needs change right now. But we do have those months to come, and Labour is going to continue to set out those really practical solutions with a mission-led government. And again, when I talked about that long-term focus from Labour, people were really attracted to that compared to the sticking plaster politics under the Conservatives that we've had for so long.
You said, obviously, you expect that you will form a majority government, but Keir Starmer seems to be wavering slightly about whether or not there would be a coalition. In July last year, he said that he is ruling out any arrangement, any kind of coalition with anyone. Yesterday, our political editor, Beth Rigby, interviewed him about a hypothetical deal with the SNP. He completely ruled it out. So we asked about a hypothetical deal with the Lib Dems. He didn't rule it out. Let's have a listen to what he said.
So you are ruling out a deal with the SNP on any terms, but you're not ruling out a deal with the Lib Dems?
Well, as you know, with the SNP, it's a fundamental difference. I do not believe in the breakup and separation of the United Kingdom.
Just to be clear, you're ruling out any sort of arrangement with the SNP, and you are not doing that with the Liberal Democrats?
But I'm clear, I'm pressing on. I want a Labour majority government, a workable majority.
We asked him that 7 times and he wouldn't answer. So a deal with the Lib Dems is possible, isn't it, if you vote Labour?
Well, actually, what Keir said was absolutely correct, that he's aiming for a majority government. And, it's not party leaders who will decide the outcome of this. But I think the question is what the electorate want, and it's going to be their decision.
The question that I'm asking you is would there potentially be a coalition with the Lib Dems? If people are going to vote Labour, they need to know whether they're voting Labour or whether they're voting Labour with the possibility of a Labour-Lib Dem coalition.
Well, what they can know very clearly is that Labour's determined not to have a coalition government, instead to have a majority Labour government. How people vote at the end of the day in the ballot box, quite rightly, it's a secret ballot. They will vote how they want to vote. I'm confident that as people see what Labour's setting out for our country, that change, so finally we can have a Britain that works for working people, when they see that they will support that majority Labour government.
But if it isn't a majority Labour government...
And that's what Keir was setting out. ...
If it isn't a majority Labour government, you're not ruling out that it could be a coalition with the Lib Dems. You're not ruling it out. Keir Starmer isn't ruling it out.
What I would say is, it's for other parties to be clear. If we have that Labour government,
but it's a
Labour government... Yeah, but if I can just finish, we have a Labour government that's setting out those plans, for example, to scrap the non-dom tax exemption, use that money to boost our NHS workforce. If we find other parties want to vote against that, well, the responsibility for it will be on their shoulders, not on Labour's shoulders, because we're setting out that prospectus for change.
OK, so he wouldn't rule it out and you're not ruling it out either. Finally, in Prime Minister's questions today, the Prime Minister called Keir Starmer, he's already called him Mr Flip-Flop, Mr Softy, he called him Mr Flaky today. There have been a lot of U-turns. We've seen tuition fees U-turn, Labour now not scrapping those, renational of the utilities, not so much there, vowing to stand with the trade unions, barring cabinet members from joining picket lines. Why should voters trust what is written in Labour's manifesto for this next election when you've U-turned on all of these things that were in your last?
Because every election is a new election when a political party will present a manifesto based on the circumstances of that time. Well, every party always draws up a new manifesto. I think people would be pretty surprised if any party just photocopied what had been there before. These circumstances are different. And actually, Keir has been really open and clear. He's not going to have a kind of last-minute, back of a fag packet, frankly, approach that we've seen far too often with policy announcements just driven by politics. We've had enough of that sticking plaster style from the Conservatives. He set out those long-term missions. They're unashamedly long-term. He's clear it's going to be difficult for us to achieve, for example, that goal of having the highest sustained growth in the G7. But nonetheless, he's determined that we as a country will get there, and he's setting out the practical measures to get there. He's not saying that it's going to be easy, but he's been very open about that fact. This is going to be a collective effort across our country. I think that's a really different style of politics, actually, that's coming from Keir. It's one that's respectful of people and that indicates he's going to govern in partnership with business, with trade unions, with local government as well, in the interests of our country. Again, a big contrast, I'm afraid, with what we've had recently.
Anneliese Dodds, thank you very much.